Good evening. My name is Ken Pomerantz. I'm the faculty director of the University of Chicago campus in Hong Kong and a professor of Chinese history. Welcome to our webinar, Foundations of Global Heritage, Cities, Cultures, and Continuities, which is part of our new webinar series, Global Heritage. The Global Heritage webinar series brings together renowned academics, heritage professionals, museum curators, and archivists to explore the diverse ways in which cultural heritage shapes, connects, and transforms societies across time and space. We are sharing tonight's event via Zoom, Facebook, and YouTube. If audience members have questions to submit, you can do so through the question and answer button by first registering on Zoom. I encourage you after the program to visit our website at www.uchicago.hk and subscribe to the e-news for the latest news and information from our campus. So let me move straight through to introduce our speakers tonight. All three of them professors at the University of Chicago. Professor Alan Kolata is Bernard E. and Ellen C. Sonny Distinguished Service Professor in the Department of Anthropology and also participates in the Committee on South Asian Studies and also the Committee on Environment, Geography, and Urbanization at the University of Chicago. Kolata's recent research interests include comparative work on agroecological systems, human-environment interactions, the human dimensions of global change, agricultural and rural development, urban social ecology, and the archaeology and ethnohistory of the Andean region. He has directed interdisciplinary research projects studying urbanism, agricultural development, and the interactions of humans with their physical environment, including long-term effects of climate change in complex societies. Professor James Osborne is an associate professor of Anatolian archaeology at the University of Chicago's Institute for the Study of Ancient Cultures. He's also interim chair of the Department of Middle Eastern Studies. Professor Osborne is an archaeologist who works in the Eastern Mediterranean and ancient Near East, focusing on the Bronze Age and Iron Age. He concentrates particularly on Anatolia within today's Republic of Turkey during the late second and early first millennium CE. Most of his publications have concentrated on the intersection of space and power, using analysis of Anatolian monumental buildings, cities, and settlement patterns, particularly during the Iron Age, as his primary subject matter. Finally, Professor Ed Shaughnessy is Lorraine and Hurley Creel Distinguished Service Professor in Early Chinese Studies. He's the Director of Graduate Studies for the East Asian Languages and Civilizations Department at the University of Chicago. Professor Shaughnessy is a renowned scholar of ancient China who studies China's archaeologically recovered texts, as well as the literary traditions in which they were created. His own personal interests include bronze inscriptions and the Zhou, both of which reached their full maturity towards the end of the Western Zhou period. He's currently heading an international team of scholars to translate all of the 4th century BCE bamboo slip manuscripts held by Tsinghua University in Beijing. And although his primary expertise lies in ancient Chinese literature, he is also the author of A Brief History of Ancient China, which not surprisingly covers many of the themes that we'll be focusing on in tonight's webinar. Thank you, all of you, for being here with us. We'll go in alphabetical order, beginning with Professor Kolata's presentation, followed by Professor Osborne, and then Professor Shaughnessy. And after that, we should have somewhere around 20 minutes for a Q&A session. And with that, I will turn it over to Alan Kolata. Thanks.
Thank you, Ken. Appreciate it. Okay, my research has been in the Andean area of Western South America. Here you can see a map, and I will talk about 3 areas that I've done primary research in over the last 20, 30 years, and that is The coast of Peru, you can see Lima here, the center, the coastal areas of Peru right here. The Andean Highlands, which is the situs of the Inca Empire I'll be referring to, and the area around Lake Titicaca, which is the Lake Titicaca Basin, the Altiplano of Peru and Bolivia, which is at elevations of 3,800 meters and above. What I want to refer to here is not so much the monuments of cities, as I do want to talk about how three major civilizations in which I've done my research have transformed landscapes at huge scale. Agro-engineering with very sophisticated technologies that did support the cities and the societies over long periods of time. Now, the earliest civilizations that generated these large-scale transformations of the landscape were actually coastal, on coastal Peru. And here you have an image of a NASA image, a satellite image of this area that gives you an idea of the dimension of the landscapes we're dealing with and also their incredible diversity. You can see from the image on the left, the coast just south of Lima, and this is classic riverine civilizations, which is one of the themes of this cultural heritage series for today. And you can just see a whole range of rivers flowing down from the Andean mountain chain down to the ocean. Then you have the Andean mountains themselves, which are heavily worked over as agro-engineered landscapes, which I'll be referring to. And then finally, to the far right of this image, it drops down into the tropical forest of the Amazon basin. So the point of this image is just to show the incredible diversity and the very challenging landscapes in which these civilizations emerged. And these are some of the most challenging landscapes on the globe. You've got an incredibly arid coast region, which is dependent on irrigated agriculture. You've got the highlands, which are dependent on the emergence of technologies that could reshape mountainscapes. And then you have the area of the Altiplano, which again has its challenges at high altitude for the production of food at scale to basically underwrite the economies of these civilizations. Here, just to give you quickly a few images. Here you can see the coastal regime. You have the Pacific Ocean, and then you can see the incredible desertic environment on the left. This is a relatively recent photograph, and just for the scale there, you see that Jeep driving along the coastal road. It gives you an idea of the aridity and then the challenges that were faced by the populations of Peru. The earliest evidence we have for major irrigated agriculture associated with an urban complex is in the central coast of Peru called Caral. It's quite famous recently for being the earliest city urban complex in the Americas, which is over 4,000 years ago. So it begins very early. But the area I worked on was distinctive and much later, and I'll get to that here in a moment. But I wanted to show you another dimension of this landscape that allows for the richness of the development, not simply of irrigated agriculture, but of maritime resources. Here you can see an image of sea lions in the north coast of Peru. The sea lions, of course, were exploited, but also the shore there you see in the horizon is really one of the richest fisheries in the globe. This area off of western and South America and also off the west coast of Africa are two of the richest fisheries. And these societies basically combined a maritime-oriented economy with irrigated agriculture. My own work has been in this coastal region, has been on the north coast of Peru. And here you see the capital city of the culture known as the Chamu, capital of Chan Chan, which I actually wrote my dissertation on many years ago. And this is really one of the apogee, if you will, of irrigated agriculture. It is a city of 6 or 7 square kilometers, and all surrounding it, you have extraordinary landscapes of production, these irrigated landscapes. Also within the city, however, you have these enormous, they're called huachaques locally, which means urban gardens and reservoirs. So integrated into the city itself were gardens within the city. And that is part of the complexity of the technological engineering, agro-engineering, because here they're essentially taking advantage of groundwater regimes as well as irrigated lands around the city. And here you get an image of how within these huachaques or in these urban gardens, crops, in this case, totora reed, were growing. But the major image here is this one, where you can see the scale of the operation. This is a particular aqueduct, and you can see the contemporary fields on the side. Those contemporary fields actually are overlaying ancient fields. So in other words, basically what's happening here, and in each of these three cases I'll talk about, there is actually a living cultural heritage. These are agricultural systems that are still being used today. And here you can see the major aqueduct system. These aqueducts then link together, in the case of the Chamu state or empire, link together multiple coastal valleys stretching over several hundred kilometers. And so it's an integrated landscape of production. And in fact, it has been given the name by some scholars as a hydraulic empire, very, very much dependent on the production at scale of crops, in this case, like corn, maize, and a whole range of other Andean crops. Here you get an idea of, as I mentioned, the actual continuing use of these canals. Here you can see the archaeological canal below, and above it, a modern canal. This is just outside of Chanshan. Indicates, again, the dynamic aspect of this environment, that it's still being exploited. There's no other way to really exploit it without these irrigated systems, which are incredibly complex and socially organized in a way that, unfortunately, there's no time here to go into detail. However, what it does indicate is that these canals were technologically sophisticated. They're running along certain contours that are still being used today. In some cases today, large agribusinesses have cement lined the canals of the Chamu. In other words, they basically have transformed an ancient heritage and continue using it. And here you can see today one of those canals, and with sugarcane growing to one side, one of the canals that still feeds this landscape and did feed this empire. The city itself probably had something on the order of 50,000 to 100,000 people, but around the city, there were multiple other smaller scale settlements and cities that had a large population. And this irrigation of the land was absolutely essential to it. One of the issues that the coastal Peru faces, however, is something I'm sure you're all familiar with. That is the El Nino phenomenon. So periodically, these canals were destroyed by floods, catastrophic floods, and other times there were, of course, major droughts. And so this is part of the technology of production, was to how to manage risk. And they were able to do that for 3 or 4 centuries with very, very few problems in terms of, there's no indication of a rupture of this system, simply a rebuilding and rebuilding in response to these crises. The second area I want to talk about is one where I spent 25 years working, and that is the Altiplano of Bolivia. Right, you see the town of La Paz here, and this Altiplano here. The Altiplano, again, is incredibly rigorous environment. It is at 3,800 meters and above. So for agricultural production, it's extraordinarily difficult. And here you can see a satellite image of Lake Titicaca, and the area I'll be talking about is right down here in particular. But this area was essentially the situs of a society known as, the locale of a society known as Tiwanaku. It was a major state and empire which expanded from the Altiplano well to the south of into Chile and into Argentina as well. And this is the center of it here. And this gives you an idea, just briefly, given the time here, I can't go into the details of the architectural heritage here, but this gives you an idea of the major ceremonial complex in the center with raised pyramids, different kinds of palace structures. The Putudi there is indicated as a palace structure. Caricala is another palace structure. So this was basically a city of the elite of Tiwanaku. They were extraordinarily wealthy. They had a long distance trade relationships throughout central and southern Peru, and this really was able to sustain this particular city and its collateral cities. This entire valley had a population of about 1.1 million by our projections. The city itself, again, was more of a city of the patrimonial elite that probably had 20 or 30 to 40 or 50,000 people, depending on how you expand the limits of it. What I want to get to, however, is really what really could sustain a society at high altitude. At 3,800 meters, it's at the limits of major intensive production of different crops. Maize would not grow here particularly, except in very, very protected environments. But of course, this was an area for the Andean high altitude adapted crops like potato and quinoa and other really localized Andean crops. This is just an image of one of the temple structures and one of the sculptural corpus that we see. It's quite extensive. But again, my focus here is on the agroecological engineering of landscapes. Here you can see one of the dimensions of how, however, the city is coordinated with or synchronized with the agricultural cycle of the seasons. More specifically, you can see it here, where these large pillars, if you will, or monolith or stela of the center of this particular temple at Tiwanaku is correlated with various elements of the agricultural season. And here you can see it from the left, the December solstice, the zenith passage, and the planting season. In other words, the city itself is harmonized with the production of, and basically simulacrum of a physical calendar of the agricultural cycle. What is really important here, though, I want to get into it quickly, the time still remaining, to look at a particular landscape that's quite extraordinary. This is an area of raised fields, as they're called, and they have an Aymara name, the people contemporarily there, called Sukukoyus, and you can see this sort of a corrugated effect on the landscape. These fields in the time of Tiwanaku were essentially expanded to over 90,000 hectares, almost 100,000 hectares of field around Lake Titicaca. And I'll just go briefly through how those fields operated, because they are an extraordinarily sophisticated technology that is adjusted to the rigors of this environment. In fact, one of the interesting dimensions of this, just briefly to mention, is there was a World Bank agronomy assessment of this landscape you're seeing here, and they came back with a report saying this is really not fit, this is almost a direct quote, not fit for human habitation because it doesn't have the ability to really support populations at scale. And the recommendation was the indigenous populations here should migrate into the lowlands and produce other forms of crops there. Ironically enough, they were there seeing this very landscape, and we began to realize, well, this landscape is a serious landscape of production. And so here you see from below what it looks like here, these long canals and long elevated raised fields. But this gives you here the idea of how it worked and how technologically sophisticated it is, because what this system is doing is really addressing the two principal constraints to agriculture, intensive agriculture that supported these ancient civilizations, or this ancient civilization here, and that is nutrient poor soils. It's simply not a nutrient rich environment, and also frost damage. Contemporary in Bolivia and Peru, 3 out of 5 years, there's catastrophic drought, catastrophic frosts that really can reduce as many as 80 to 90% of production in a particularly bad year. So this system here, which was developed probably around two or 300 years before the Common Era, and in this area we're looking at here, it's from 400 to about 1100 of the Common Era. And here you can see the dimensions of this particular technology. Two elements of it is that basically it acts as a solar heating agroecological system. The canals between the fields absorb solar energy during the evening, and then rather during the day, and then in the evening it radiates back out over the fields. So it essentially is kind of a solar agriculture at scale, and we're talking 90,000 hectares. So this is an enormous effect. The second thing it does is the water canals between actually are colonized by a particular water fern called azolla there, which is essentially an organic matter that disintegrates over the agricultural cycle. It goes down into the bottom of the canal, and then there's a process of cleaning the canals. In other words, this is acting both as a solar heating system of agriculture as well as a generator of fertilizer, organic fertilizer. So this is how productive the system was. So we decided, well, the World Bank says it's not really something that could really work and that people should really migrate. And we began to rehabilitate the fields to see, well, what could we do? How could we produce it? And here you can see the community I work with called La Calla, opening up some of this area. Eventually, we did about 200 hectares of fields. Here you can see the results of the production, how extraordinarily productive it was. And here you can see the community, in this case, harvesting potatoes. And just the final metric on this is that in terms of multiple experiments we did over time, this form of agriculture produces anywhere from 2 to 8 times the amount of harvest you would get on a normal fallow, sort of a Spanish colonial introduced form of agriculture. They didn't really use this landscape. However, the indigenous populations of Tiwanaku and to this day still use this system because of its effectiveness of being able to combat these two constraints, ecological constraints of frost and nutrient poor soils. So the final case study I want to look at here is one that I'm sure all of you are quite familiar with, and this is the Inca Empire. Here you can see the extent of it. It essentially is 4,000 kilometers long along the coast and into the mountains and down into the eastern slopes of the Andes, from Chile all the way up to Colombia. So this is an extraordinarily extensive empire. And again, it was founded and based upon a particular form of agriculture. Here you can see what the landscape looks like. Again, another challenge for agricultural production. Here, actually, what you're seeing in the foreground is the remains of a road system that linked together over 40,000 kilometers of the Andean landscape in time of the Inca. And you can see pavement stones here, and here you can see roads that are still used, in this case, right around Lake Titicaca. These are the Inca roads that link together multiple agricultural landscapes. And those landscapes are themselves as well incredibly innovative, incredibly part of the reason that the Inca Empire was as wealthy, as powerful, and could expand as dramatically as it did. And here's an image that I'm sure many of you may have been to, of course, Machu Picchu. This is an image of Machu Picchu with terraces down either side. This was a royal estate of one of the principal kings of the Inca Empire. The Inca themselves developed these royal estates all around, again, these mountain terraces, and essentially use the terraces for productive reasons. And here you can see again, just outside of Cusco in the so-called Sacred Valley, the entire landscape is geoengineered. This is one of the great, as you say, heritages, global heritages of the Andean world. And in the case of the Inca, you're talking about over 1 million hectares of landscape were reshaped and reshaped, building on prior societies who were also terracing, but the Inca take this to another scale. And here you can see not only the productive landscapes, but also the aesthetic quality. There really is an aesthetic quality to these terraces. They essentially, here you can see, again, a major site integrated within the terraces. So it's the mountain and the cities are essentially integrated into a landscape of production. And here, again, you can see the extraordinary, in this case, a viewshed from one of the major Inca settlements into the agricultural terraces. So it's not as if agriculture was often in the hinterlands. It was fully integrated into the urban life, in and around the urban life, as were the canals and the reservoirs in the case of Chanchan back on the coast of Peru. And then here in my final image, it gives you an idea of all that production. What was it about? Well, it was about storage. It was about the ability to put together a whole string of storerooms from one end, from Chile all the way up to Ecuador, in these forms, in these structures you see in the lower left here, in one particular site known as Huanacopampa, very sophisticated storerooms in which they were able to store corn, potatoes, a whole range of other amaranth, quinoa, a whole other range of products. They also were able to preserve this through various kinds of technologies for instance, potatoes were basically freeze dried and would be able to be put into these storage facilities for 2, 3, 4 years. So this was basically part of the way the Inca Empire was able to expand, was to develop this long chain of literally hundreds of thousands of these storerooms throughout the empire. And up in the upper right, you can see an image from a manuscript from 1612 of an Inca emperor referring to consulting on what is known as a quipu, a string, which is essentially a recording device that was used to record the amount of product going into these what are called kolka, or storerooms. And you can see there the little image of the round storage facilities there. So basically, what this really speaks to is all three of these societies, from the coast, Chan Chan, Tiwanaku, and the Inca, were heavily involved in agricultural production. That was part of their organizational system. It was really the way these societies were able to sustain themselves in some of the most challenging environments on the globe. The final comment I would make is that, again, to reemphasize, this is a living global heritage. It's a living heritage. Each of these systems of agriculture production, the terraces are being cultivated today. The Inca terraces are being cultivated. Some of them are being restored. The raised fields, to a much lesser extent, are being restored, and still communities do work with that form. And then on the irrigated terraces, irrigated landscapes of the coastal Peru, as I've already shown you, agribusiness today is reutilizing some of these canals. So this really shows you the connectivity of the past into the present in this Andean world. I wish there were time to go at length about the organizational system here, but of course, at this point, I think we have to move on.
Thanks very much, Alan. We will move on now to James Osborne and to the ancient Near East.
Thank you. Let me just share my screen here. I hope you can all see everything and hear me just fine. I see some nods already, so I'll proceed. Thank you very much, Kenneth, for this invitation to present here. And good morning to those of us in Chicago, and good evening to those of you in Hong Kong. It's very nice to be here with you all today. I was asked to give an overview of some significant developments in the trajectory of urbanism and urbanization in my area of specialty, which is ancient Anatolia, or ancient Turkey, as kind of said in the introduction. And since that's a large and vast topic, I thought I would focus in on a couple of specific episodes, much in the same way that Professor Kolata did actually in his presentation. We'll be focusing on the Neolithic period and the Bronze and Iron Age periods in the region of Turkey that I work, which is the Konya Plain of South Central Anatolia. And then at the end, I'm going to just very briefly point to some landscape water management issues that the landscape is having today, right now in the present, in ways that are in some ways echoing some developments in the past. So I apologize for the selective nature of the talk. There's just too much to go over in Anatolian history otherwise. The geography is also itself immense, of course. This is a map of the current topography of Turkey. And as I always tell my students in introduction classes of archaeology of the region, the size of Turkey is sufficiently large that it's bigger than the rest of the Middle East combined. That is, it's larger than all of Cyprus, Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Iraq all together. And when you consider the vast amount of history and archaeology that's contained within each one of those individual countries, you get a sense of the level of complexity and social variety that we're dealing with in ancient Turkey. It's also large enough, of course, that you would expect there to be a vast difference in the nature of the cultural expressions that appear in different parts of it. So in the east, for example, we have an extremely mountainous highland region, which of course affects the nature of cultural expressions there. Southeast of those mountains, it's effectively the ancient Near East. It's more or less Mesopotamian civilization, whereas often the very western part of the country, we're dealing with an effectively Aegean culture that's more or less similar with, let's say, ancient Greece. It's really in the center of the country. Let me just pull up a cursor here. In the center of the country, which we call the Anatolian Plateau, that we see yet a third region of cultural expressions. And it's here that I'm going to be talking about today. And I will especially be talking about this region here in the South Central Anatolia. The culture history of the area is also overwhelmingly rich. Needless to say, don't worry right now. I'm not going to be talking about all of these different periods. It's simply not possible. But Turkey is very famous for being one of the richest archaeological zones in the world. And indeed, every time you tell someone who lives in Turkey that you're an archaeologist, they'll say, "Oh, I was just excavating my garden because I found some great coins as I was digging my flower beds and putting in a well." I mean, there's just stuff that turns up in everybody's plots of land all across the country. It's honestly, it's difficult to manage intellectually the vast amount of material that's in this space. What we're going to be focusing on then is this very earliest period, the Neolithic period, the period of early agropastoral villages on the one hand, And then I'm going to move on. I'm going to skip ahead to this period of early states in the Hittite Empire of the late Bronze Age. And then, as I said, in the very end, I'll talk about the present just very, very briefly. But I would say a proper analysis would walk you through all of these periods. So if you invite me back for a week-long seminar, I'll give you that. This is not really a riverine-based civilization as so many major civilization centers are. Think Mesopotamia, nourished by the Euphrates and Tigris rivers, or think ancient Egypt, let's say, of course, famously associated with the Nile River. In this case, although of course the Anatolian Plateau does have rivers running through it, they're not civilizationally defining in the same way. They're not navigable. There's no inland navigable river within ancient Turkey. And likewise, they're not flooding and as a result, having civilizations sprouting up directly associated with those rivers in most cases. Instead, the Central Anatolian Plateau is an extraordinarily dry place. That's really its characteristic feature in terms of water. Unlike, as you can see on this map, the Black Sea coast to the north and the Mediterranean coast to the south, which are characterized by tremendous amounts of rainfall. And if any of you have visited these coastal regions, which many tourists do, then you're very familiar with the incredible humidity that characterizes your time on the beach there. That's not the case when you move inland past the mountain chains and onto the plateau, where although it does get quite hot, it's incredibly, incredibly dry. Um, I've circled here in black the Konya Plain. This is the region that I work in, and is going to be the case studies that I present to you now. This is also an extraordinarily dry region. So I find this an interesting case study to give students because it's often counterintuitive to many people who consider water and riverine cultures to be so integral to the origins of civilization. Here we have a case where it's actually very dry, where there's not a lot of precipitation, and where there is no massive navigable river to sustain, the complex society that are often associated with those features. And yet, nevertheless, of course, complex society did manage to thrive here, despite the general starkness of the landscape. And indeed, the Central Anatolian Plateau is a stark place. It has its own beauty, which I'm very fond of and which many people love, but it is not lush. It is not green. It looks incredibly different from the Mediterranean landscapes that people often associate with Turkey, because of course that's what one visits when one's a tourist. And the Central Anatolian Plateau tends to be off the tourist beaten path. Most tourists will visit, of course, Istanbul, and they'll visit the coastal Greek cities of classical antiquity, and they'll enjoy the beaches. And the Central Anatolian Plateau tends to be much less visited, despite the fact that it is home to thousands and thousands of archaeological sites. So we're looking here in the middle. That mound is not a natural hill. That's an archaeological site. What in Turkish is called a huyuk, or in Arabic is known as a tell. This is an archaeological site that develops over time as settlement gets stacked on top of settlement, rebuilding and rebuilding over the successive centuries, eventually forming a very tall feature that then turns into something that looks like a hill after it's abandoned and all the buildings sort of fade away and dry and melt and collapse. And then eventually you can't recognize it as something that's not natural unless you have a trained archaeological eye. And then as soon as you do, of course, when you drive through the Central Anatolian Plateau, as you look out the car window, you notice dotting the landscape are these artificial hills that, of course, each contain archaeological settlements. In this case, this particular Huyuk, standing maybe 20 meters tall or so, probably has at least 2,000 to 3,000 years of occupation, I would say, contained within it. The Konya Basin, or the Konya Plain as it's known today, is one small exception to the general principle I just said of how ancient civilization in Anatolia isn't necessarily characterized by its relationship to water. In this particular locale or a highly localized region, that is actually a defining feature of it in ways that, as we'll see, have a tremendous impact on the cultural and political developments in the region. During the last glacial maximum, which ended about 15,000 years ago, the entire Konya Plain was covered by what we call now a paleo lake that left behind it an extremely dry steppe-like landscape. That was then complemented by the appearance of a river called the Çarşamba River in Turkish, which means the Wednesday River, that flows into the plain from surrounding mountains. And because it has no natural outlet, I think the word is endoheric basin, that this is a contained basin that doesn't itself lead to any external water sources like the Mediterranean or Black Sea. It's completely contained within the landscape here. The river flows into this contained region and therefore has to debouch into this dry steppe. And what's that has created is within this dry steppe an incredibly rich agricultural landscape, because as the river deposits itself in the landscape, it takes with it the soils that it's collected on its journey from the mountains. Those then get deposited as alluvium onto the plain surface, and then that creates an incredibly agriculturally rich, fertile landscape, at least in this area of the delta of the river. Um, Now, as you can imagine, because there is this highly localized area of incredibly rich soils, it's not just agriculturally rich, it is now, of course, also archaeologically rich. And there are hundreds and hundreds of archaeological sites dating from all periods, from the present down into the deep antiquity, um, of settlements that are exploiting this incredibly rich uh, landscape for agricultural purposes. Sites like Çatalhöyük, for example, which is one of Turkey's most famous sites. You can see in the center of your screen, of course, the mound itself. That's the Höyük of Çatalhöyük, which, by the way, means fork mound in Turkish, probably referring to the fact that it's a twin-mounded morphological feature. There's one major mound here, a second smaller mound to the west. Kind of like the prongs of a fork, perhaps. That's sort of our etymology or explanation of the term Çatalhöyük. And behind the mounds, then you can see the fields, the modern agricultural fields, taking advantage of these rich alluvial soils that come from the Çarşamba River. So this doesn't look like the stark landscape I just showed you. But if we were to go, 150, 200 kilometers in any direction, we would indeed be in that steppe kind of landscape. This is now a World Heritage Site for reasons I'll tell you about in just a minute. If you go visit today, and I strongly recommend that you do, this is not quite what you see. Of course, the mounds are still there, but now in the middle, sandwiched between the two mounds, is a gigantic museum complex and parking lot, and you ticket booths and tourist buses and all the rest of it. It's quite a different looking space now as of the last 5 years or so. But I have to say, it's all extremely well done, and I think it's absolutely worth visiting. This is a spectacular site and well worth going off on a day trip from the beach. Çatalhöyük, so here's our Konya Basin, now the Konya Plain. Here's the delta of the Çarşamba River, and there's Çatalhöyük located right in the heart of it. As you can see, based on the settlement map, it is by far the largest site at the time. By Neolithic standards, this is considered a mega site, even though it has probably a population of, let's say, 2,000 people or so at most. The narrative of the Neolithic period is one of the beginnings of agriculture. This is the time when animals and plants are being domesticated in Turkey, the beginnings of sedentary settlements, people living in one place full-time, year-round. And yet, despite the fact that they are now reaching new heights in terms of their subsistence strategies, there's still extremely little evidence for any social stratification whatsoever. This is a highly egalitarian time and place still. We are able to reconstruct, to a certain extent at least, what the landscape would have looked like at the time that this was occupied in the 7th millennium BC, so 8,000 years ago. What did the ancient environment look like? Did it look more or less the same as it did today, or did it look different? We're able to tell that by conducting geological cores in rows around the site. Here, the archaeologists are using a mechanized auger to drill a hole into the ground. These holes can extend many meters in depth to reach the original plain levels from 8,000 years ago. And then pedologists or soil scientists are able to analyze the soils and understand what plant life, what kind of water life, and so on would have been characterizing the landscape based on at different depths. The deeper you go, the older you're getting, and you can date these samples based on the radiocarbon dates of organic material that comes up with your cores. And archaeologists are able to now understand that indeed the landscape did look a little bit different in the Neolithic period than it does today. We thought originally, before we did this robust program of geological coring, that Çatalhöyük was kind of an island surrounded by marshland that people would have had to then travel long distances to get beyond the marsh into viable agricultural land, and then would have had to have been schlepping their agricultural produce back and forth into the settlement at great expense. It turns out now, thanks to this work, that we know the landscape was highly variable, with raised areas interspersed between many low river branches, in a way not too dissimilar from what Professor Kolata was just describing in the Andes, although in this case, these are natural features, right? This is a river formation that is now spread into many different small branches. I forget the word for this now. There's a specific word for this type of river. I apologize, my mind is blanking. It's too early. But in any event, the fact that there are so many different elevations of land and so many different small branches of water leads to the fact that there are many different types of plants that are able to grow in these sort of micro environments. And the inhabitants of Çatal were able to capitalize on that mixed environment to sustain the settlement based on a highly variable crop regime. So different plants could be grown in areas just 50, 100 meters apart from one another, which led to, a large amount of variability in their dietary patterns. There are several famous traits of Çatalhöyük. I really love this site, and I could keep going to talk about it forever. One famous trait that it has is that there's no streets within its settlement plan. Access to all of these buildings is from the roof, so you actually have to picture the social landscape being not anything that we're excavating. The social landscape would have been at the roof level. That's where people were walking around and meeting neighbors and shaking hands and so on. Also on this plan on the left, you can see that there's no evidence for social complexity in the sense that, to the extent that architecture is an index of such, there's not like one building that's much larger than others. There's no obvious palace or not even really a larger obvious elite residence. Everybody is more or less at the same social scale, living in houses of more or less the same size. And this photograph on the right shows you conveniently walls of houses, an exterior wall and an exterior wall here. They're built right up one another, right up against one another. There's no space in between to be walking around. I mean, that's just how the nature of the settlement developed. Another famous trait of this settlement is an extreme level of continuity through time. So on the left, you can see superimposed plans of buildings that have been excavated. And as we excavate downward, of course, we're getting deeper and deeper in time. And note, however, that the building plans of these houses more or less stays the same, no matter how far deep you go. And for those of you that have any experience archaeologically, you know that on the right, this larger image, we're looking at what we call the profile drawing or the section drawing of the excavated area. The archaeologists here are drawing the wall of the excavation square as they go down. All of these gray features here are the walls that they've excavated and removed. And between them are the room fillings and then the floors of the buildings, the successive buildings as they go deeper and deeper. And again, you can see the walls are stacked one on top of one another. And so as a house goes out of use and is rebuilt, they're just reusing the exact same building plan again and again and again. In some places and some areas of the site, upwards of 700 years of continuity of the exact same building plan, which is a radically different conception of space than we're used to today, of course, where things change so rapidly even within a single lifetime. Another really important characteristic of Çatalhöyük is its incredibly rich symbolic regime. So all of these houses are plastered on the inside of the mud brick walls, and then those walls are then covered in paint. And what you might recognize in these black and white buildings on this particular wall painting is something that looks not dissimilar from the archaeological plan I just showed you a couple of slides ago, because archaeologists indeed interpret this to be a sort of neighborhood plan, a building plan, almost a blueprint of Çatalhöyük itself, painted by the residents of Çatalhöyük. And this orange feature, which at first might look like a leopard skin or something like that, we actually think to be an exploding volcano, and indeed visible from Çatalhöyük off in the distance is a volcano known as Hasan Dağ or Mount Hasan in English that actually looks a lot like this volcano. So that's pretty interesting. But there's paintings like this all over the walls of the houses of Çatalhöyük. Let's just take a moment to look at one specific building in detail. This is a recent excavation photograph showing one house that's been entirely excavated. I think you could probably see even in the topsoil that's just been scraped off the surface surrounding these walls, additional walls of additional houses running beside this one, in this case, buildings that haven't been excavated. So this is a juicy or tantalizing photograph for archaeologists because you can see the walls and you know as soon as you excavate in here, you've got another house just like this one, which has already been excavated. Um, there are a lot of what to our minds seem like bizarre domestic ritual practices in the Neolithic period at Çatalhöyük. For example, the platform in the corner of this living room is ringed with the skulls that are encased in plaster here. The horns of the head of these aurochs skulls, aurochs being an ancient bull species that's now extinct, are left exposed. The skull is for some reason contained within the plaster here. Inside the plaster, this bump in the wall, in fact, contains the skull of a leopard, which is odd. The archaeologists call these incorporations. As the archaeologists peel back the layers of plaster, because of course plaster needs to be repainted on a nearly annual basis, and you can tell that there's every year different wall paintings are placed on the plaster. So here the archaeologists have peeled back a couple of layers. They've removed the leopard skull that was incorporated in the wall here and found that at this particular level, the inhabitants of the house had covered their walls with handprints, which is interesting. Likewise, when they excavated inside the plaster, now the bull skulls have been removed. What did they find but human remains? So the occupants of Çatalhöyük were burying deceased family members literally inside the floors of their living rooms. So this is a highly charged, a symbolically incredibly packed space. These houses were covered with symbols contained within the actual architecture of the house, and then, of course, the human bodies themselves placed underfoot. So you have to picture these houses being, extremely symbolically laden. Let's fast forward then 4,500 years and take us into the Bronze Age during the period, let's say around 1500 BCE, when now ancient Anatolia is characterized by the Hittite Empire, the Hittite state. And the Hittite Empire is a large and expansive state that eventually incorporates all of Anatolia within its political orbit. The Hittite itself is an Indo-European language. In fact, it's the earliest Indo-European language that we have recorded in the world. So it's literally related to English. The Hittite word for water is watar, and there's all kinds of examples like that. At this time, as you can see now, the Konya Plain is characterized by a much greater amount of stratification. There are now settlements that are extremely large, or one settlement that's extremely large, many settlements that are very large, then a large number of villages. It is no longer an egalitarian organization the way that it had been in the Neolithic period. It is now characterized by tremendous stratification. This site of Turkmenkarhöyük is a good example of that. This is the site that I excavate along with my co-director Michele Massa, a professor at Bilkent University in Turkey. We just started this excavation project, and it's a massive, massive site. In fact, it's at least 6 times larger than Çatalhöyük was several thousand years earlier. At this time period, it's roughly 60 hectares in site. And at 35 meters tall, it contains within it almost 3,000 years of archaeological successive occupation. So yeah, this site is a testament to it sort of corresponds to the new political complexity, right? It's the scale of it is, as one would expect, corresponding to the political complexity that Anatolia is now characterized by. I don't have tremendous amounts of city plans. Like I can't show you city plans from the late Bronze Age from Turkmenkarhöyük, my site, which by the way is only 18 kilometers away from Çatal, the way that I could for Çatal, because we only just started excavating it last summer. And at this scale, you can tell it's going to be a lifelong project. It might be some years before I have a city plan like that to show you. But I can show you some interesting aspects of landscape uses that are now quite different from how it had been used in the Neolithic period. Because far from being more or less uh, a venue for subsistence strategies to be enacted as it had been in the Neolithic, the landscape is now ideologically incorporated into the state religion and state ideological purposes of the Hittite state. This is one example of a landscape monument that the Hittite state was very fond of creating. It was putting landscape monuments all around the Anatolian plateau so that travelers were always constantly being reminded of the Hittite imperial strategies, no matter where they were. In this particular case, this is a artificial pool that's built around a natural spring. And I'm showing you it in a dry season so that you can see the base of this statue, which is about 3 meters in tall. If I was standing here, I would come up to about where my cursor is right now. It's about twice as high as my height. And this is the level of the water when it's full of water. And what we have here are mountain gods sustaining life on Earth that is then sustaining winged solar disks at the top. So it's kind of like a vision of the Hittite cosmology here. But there are holes in the mountains, the skirts representing the mountain gods, representing the mountains themselves of the mountain gods. There are holes in the mountains of the skirts of these mountain gods through which the water comes from the spring and then fills up the pool. So they're showing how water is in this stark, dry landscape, the foundational element of the religious ideological system. And watery sources like springs become incredibly important access points in order for people to be able to identify to have access to the divine realm. You can see why that would be the case. In a dry landscape like this, water resources become incredibly important religiously, and the state takes advantage of that feature. Okay, here's the box highlighting the feature I was just describing. The Konya Plain is no exception to this. It's a good example of landscape monuments in the new state religious order that I'm describing. These are two mountains, Karada, which means dark mountain, and which is this large volcano off in the distance, and in front of it, Kuzulda, which means Crimson Mountain, a much smaller hill, 13 kilometers in front of it. These are visible from everywhere in the Konya Plain. This photograph is taken from near Turkmenkarahuik, so I'm more or less standing at that late Bronze Age urban center and taking a photograph of Karada and Kızıldağ. And the Hittite state did not want to leave a good mountain unexploited ideologically, so of course it placed on top of these places significant landscape monuments. This photograph on the top left is showing you the actual crater of the Karada, the massive volcanic crater that's now extinct. The arrow marks the point at the very, very highest point. I mean, it's high enough that when you get up there, your ears hurt. I mean, it's incredibly quite elevated, although I don't have the elevation offhand to give you the exact number. But in any event, you can't visit there now because it's occupied now by a military base and who won't let you drive into the compound. But 100 years ago, when archaeologists first visited it and first discovered this location, they realized that kings from Turkmenkarahuik, this fellow named Hartipu, had inscribed inscriptions all around this very highest point, proclaiming himself king and describing how he devoted this mountain to the Hittite state pantheon. Unfortunately, as I say, we can't visit that anymore. One place that we can visit, however, is the smaller mountain of Kızıldağ, standing in front of it between Turkmenkarahuik and Karada. And on this rocky outcrop on the slopes of the mountain, where this gentleman is placing his right hand, which he absolutely shouldn't be doing, he is touching a relief that depicts the king from Turkmenkarahuik with an inscription in front of his face that says, "My name is Great King Hartipu," the same individual who would compose the inscriptions higher up in the crater of the volcano. Uh, so, yes, taking advantage of this rocky prominence that overlooks the vast Konya Plain in order to make a presence. And we have reconstructed then a sort of ritual, a royal ritual procession that would proceed from Turkmenkarahuik, somehow make its way across the lake in between the mountains and get itself to Kızıldağ before eventually clambering up the slopes of the volcano of Karada. And therefore, in the process of conducting this ritual procession, incorporating the people, the populace, into the religious state apparatus. And you can picture, the population of Turkmenkarhuyuk standing at the base of the mountain while King Hartepuu stands atop where this gentleman in the white shirt is standing, let's say, and reads his proclamations or does his state rituals or what have you. I'll just move on then to my very final point, which is simply to say that the water management in this area continues to be a massive consideration for the local residents of Konya. If this is what the Konya Plain looks like today in the distance, not too long ago, just 30, 40 years ago, this is a photograph from the 1970s, the landscape looked like this. And this is a result, of course, of mechanized agriculture and extreme exploitation of the land in a way that's incredibly problematic. And as the lake dries up over the years in the early 2000s, now there's absolutely no lake there at all. And of course, today, regional urban planners this is my final slide. Don't worry. Regional planners think, you know what? There should have been a lake here. We should put a lake here. And so now they've trying to replace the lake that they've drained with this enormous, massive barrage or dam that they're trying to fill with infrastructure features, hydraulic features taking water from hundreds of kilometers away. But that is a completely futile project, and this remains an empty, barren landscape. It's sort of returned to the step that it had been before the Charshamba started flowing into the area 10,000 years ago. So all of which is to say that the relationship between the populace and water management continues to be an incredibly important feature of life in the region. On that optimistic note, I'll just cut short there. Apologies for going over. Thank you, Kenneth, for interjecting.
Very much. And we'll move on to Ed Shaughnessy.
Hi, Ken. Good morning to you and everyone else in Chicago. Good evening to people in East Asia. Ken, as I told you the other day at lunch, I'm rather an outlier in this crowd. I'm not an archaeologist at all, and I never think about riverine cities. So I was only asked less than 2 months ago to join this crowd, and so put together uh, a slideshow for you on two different cities that have something to do with rivers. They're probably the two first big cities in China, Anyang and Xi'an, or a little bit to the about 100 kilometers to the west of Xi'an. So Anyang uh, occupied roughly 1250 to about 1050 BC. It's the site to which oracle bones were discovered, at which they were discovered at the end of the 19th century, and that prompted archaeology in China. So there is a little bit of connection between me and archaeology, but not much. Um, Modern archaeological excavation started at Anyang under Academia Sinica, and it was, in terms of cultural heritage sites, it was the first so named site in the People's Republic of China as early as 1950, the year after the founding of the Republic in 1949. And Anyang has been continuously excavated for the next 75 years. And I read recently that its population is conservatively estimated at over 100,000 people. That sounds too high to me, but having heard Alan now talking about the Andean populations of perhaps also that scale, maybe it's reasonable. Oracle bone inscriptions, shortly after Academia Sinica began excavating at Anyang, they uncovered some of these full turtle shells, which gave them enough context to begin reconstructing the history of the late Shang dynasty. Um, and the archaeologist also excavated what's known as the royal tombs that are on one side of a river. This one excavated in 1933-34, probably it is the largest royal tomb in Anyang. You can get some sense of the scale of this tomb. Unfortunately, it was robbed completely bare. in antiquity. So there was almost nothing left in the tomb when the archaeologist opened it up. But at least you get some sense of the scale of the tomb. I wanted to give you a little bit of local Chicago color. In 1935, Hurley Creel, whose name my professorship bears, visited the site, and that's him in the middle there, together with his wife. And again, you can get some sense of the scale of that particular tomb. And I might mention that Professor Creel's first book, The Birth of China, which talks about the excavations then ongoing. This was published in 1936, then ongoing at Anyang, has just been translated into Chinese for the very first time. So 90 years after its original publication. And there, for people viewing this in East Asia and able to read Chinese, you finally have the opportunity to read Professor Creel's book. It's rather out of date, but it's still exciting about in terms of introducing the original discoveries. In 1937, there was a pit opened up with 17,000 pieces of turtle shell in it. And that really revolutionized the writing of the history of this time period, particularly the history of the 2 decades on either side of 1200 BC. This was during the reign of King Wu Ding. And just a sort of cultural note, this, when they opened the tomb up, it was June the 12th of 1937. The Japanese army was moving close to Anyang at that time, and the archaeologists didn't have time to excavate. They said didn't have time to excavate the site on site, and so they dug it out of the ground and shipped it like this to Nanjing, the capital. And then, of course, they had to move it from Nanjing when the Japanese army made it to Nanjing and moved it to the west in Yunnan. In any event, this was one of the great discoveries of Anyang. And a little more local color, there is me together with one of the archaeologists. This was in 1984. This is Hu Hoxuan, who was one of the archaeologists back in the 1930s. Oracle bones continue to be discovered. So 600 oracle bones, almost full plastrons, found to the east of the Palace District in 1990. And the reason I'm showing oracle bones is because these were the earliest supports for writing, and the earliest writing that we know in China was on oracle bones. Give you some sense of the site. I don't need to show big maps of China where Anyang is. I think for most of the viewers, China is not as exotic as either Turkey or Chile. But the city of Anyang, you can see, I don't know if I can, I don't have a cursor, but right in the middle of the slide, what's noted as Yinshu Museum is where the site, the main site was. And here's just a topographical view from space. Once again, Yinshu Museum right in the middle of it. You can't see very well, but the museum sits right in the bend of a river. And so riverine cities, I suppose, should have attracted some of my attention. You can see from this photograph the river that winds itself around the Palace District, and here a better site of it. So Yinshu Museum once again is the main site that we're talking about. And you can see how it's nestled right in the bend of what was once called the Huan River, which I think probably means winding river. It's now been renamed to just be the Anyang River. And the original excavations were there where the Yinshi Museum is. Um, Looks like the palace, and it's now called the Palace District. Uh, and Here you can see that it too has had museums built, so reconstructed buildings along there that when I last was there in 1987 hadn't yet been built. Um, but you can also see how the river winds around it. Most of the excavations of the recent 2 to 3 decades have been to the west of this site, to what would be the left as we're looking at it. And it's turned up multiple workshops of bronze foundries, bone workshops, and also some sort of warehouses, such as what Alan was talking about. Um, and across the river is where the royal cemetery was. There were 11 kings who lived during the occupation at Anyang. Seven of them to the left there, four to the right, and that seems to correspond to a kind of theological change that took place between the first 100 years or so of the 150-year occupation and the last 50 years, maybe, or the last 75 years of the occupation. But this is to the north and slightly east of the Palace District. I should mention too that this area more recently, since 2000, basically since 2000, they've discovered a site still earlier than the Yinshu site, which is to say, a site that goes back to about 1300 to maybe 1220 BC. This was the original occupation of Anyang, and it's still very much under excavation right now. Um, so with that, I wanted to move about 1,000 kilometers to the west to a site known as the Zhouyuan, the Plain of Zhou, which was the homeland of the Zhou people. They are the people who overthrew the Shang in what I think was 1045 BC. According to tradition, this area, which is about 100 kilometers to the west and slightly north of modern-day Xi'an, um, was first settled roughly 1150 BC, people moving from further to the east into an area just south of, and I was amused by James talking about Çatalhöyük being the forked mound. This site is just south of Qishan, which means forked mountain in Chinese, and it has a fork in the mountain, just as Çatalhöyük seems to have. Um, uh, the Zhou people developed there, and about a century after occupying the Zhouyuan, the king of the people, but before the overthrow of the Shang people, is supposed to have established a capital city further to the east, right along the Feng River, which is a tributary of the Wei River, just slightly west of modern-day Xi'an. Um, his son, who is the king who did overthrow the Shang dynasty in 1045, is supposed to have then built a new capital just to the east of the Feng River, in modern-day Xi'an, and this is a city called Hao. We're going to see at the end of my presentation that these two cities they certainly were there, but they may not have been the capital of the kingdom. Archaeological excavations in the 1970s at the Zhouyuan unearthed hundreds and maybe thousands of tombs and caches. These caches were pits in the ground where bronze vessels were secreted for safekeeping when the site was being overrun in the early decades of the 8th century BC. 771 is the year that we usually give for the end of the Western Zhou dynasty. And so at that time, people thought that this was a kind of ritual center and didn't have a large population. However, very recent excavations, just started in 2020 and now ongoing, suggest that the Zhouyuan was actually a major city, probably known as Zhongzhou, the ancestral Zhou, and almost certainly was the capital, not the two cities of Feng and Hao. A little more local color, this from a bicycle trip that I made in 1993 together with someone who is actually an archaeologist, Lothar von Falkenhausen. We were riding our bikes from Xi'an out to the Zhouyuan. Um, Here is the Zhouyuan right in the middle of this slide. You'll see Fufeng County and Qishan County, the green, the light green there. And to take us back to riverine cities, the major river of this area is called the Wei River, and it's you can see it in sort of blue there. Um, the Zhouyuan actually sits on an elevated plain just above the floodplain of the Wei River, and then that's the Wei River to the south of it, and then to the north is Forked Mountain, Qishan. Um, so here you can get a better view of the topography of this with the river flowing from west to east. It's the main tributary of the Yellow River, where it merges with the Yellow River about 150 kilometers to the east of this. Um, and just a satellite view, you can see to the south of the rivers of the river is a major mountain uh, formation that divides Shanxi province from Sichuan province. Um, and just from the 1970s, the archaeological excavations that were ongoing, this just gives you a distribution of the number of sites that were excavated in the 10-year period from 1970 to 1980. In English, uh, you can see these are either tombs or these caches, and I wanted to just illustrate the what the caches were all about. This is the excavation in 1976 of one of the largest cache, at least excavated by archaeologists. There were larger caches that were robbed in preceding decades. But you can see the number of bronze vessels that were taken out of this cache. Here's an indication of the bronzes from 4 different generations of the ancestors of this one family. Once again, these were buried probably in the 770s as the site was being overrun by maybe Turks, people from west of the Chinese Central Plains. Um, in the 1970s, excavations turned up what people thought were palaces. So the one on the left actually produced a number of oracle bones, about 300 of them. They were the first oracle bones that we had from the Zhou dynasty. To the right is what was thought to be a ritual center very near. Both of these were within a kilometer of each other. Um, and again, at the time, it was thought that this was just a ritual center that was not very populated. Um, the uh, uh, the site that produced the oracle bones, which were found in the foundation of a room just to the bottom left of the picture here. But you can see that in terms of cultural heritage, this is what's known in Chinese as a Siheyuan, just uh, a, a rectangular complex with a central courtyard and one building that is in the middle, and then uh, living rooms, living space, bedrooms to the back of it. It's very much what the Forbidden City in Beijing is modeled upon. So that this layout of a palace is something that continued throughout the 3,000 years of Chinese history. Here's an example of one of the oracle bones that was discovered at this site. This is not the earliest writing in China, but again, it's the first time that oracle bones were discovered. Though from the west, from the Zhou dynasty, is the golden age of Chinese history, from which we have the first written books. Really, we have thousands, at least 15,000 inscribed bronze vessels that tell about all sorts of things. I'm coming to the end. This is in a very recent photo of excavations that are going on there. You can see the mountains in the back. So this is looking from south to north. The mountains in the north are, in fact, that Qishan, Hooked Mountain. And uh, Here is a drawing which I can't really pretend to be able to interpret for you the way James interpreted his drawings, but this is a drawing by archaeologists of the city now that seems to have been built right on the Zhouyuan, which is um, uh, about 15 square kilometers. I tell my students that it's roughly the size of Hyde Park in Chicago. And you can walk around the perimeter of the site in uh, 5 or 6 hours. It took me back when I was younger. Um, and here is a color-coded aerial view of this city. Um, the dark red are the foundations of buildings. The light red is the wall that was completely surrounding this, and it it had roads, so people didn't walk across the roofs of this site. But you can see just how densely occupied the site was. I have no idea what sort of population it would have uh, supported, but the surrounding area is incredibly rich agriculturally. Um, the dark green to the immediate right of the site is a kind of ravine or gully that has been cut into the soil just over the last 500 years or so. Though the whole area is just covered in these kinds of ravines that um, cut through the very particulate soil and then flow into the Wei River to the south. So they've become larger and larger over time. In terms of cultural heritage, um, the Shang site at Anyang was the second of what Chinese people refer to as the three first kingdoms or dynasties. The site was burned by the Zhou invaders in 1045. It in later times was always known as Yinshu. The Yinshu Museum that we saw on the maps means the waste of Yin. It was the discovery of oracle bones there that really led to uh, the introduction of modern archaeology to China, and that has just rewritten the way that we do history in China. The Zhou on the other hand, the capital of the Zhou people, for some 275 years, from 1045 to 771 BC. It had another capital further to the east, some 300 kilometers to the east, right in the center of China. But the Zhou was also overrun, as was the Shang, and they buried their bronze vessels in those caches that I described. Uh, and the Zhou people never returned to the Zhou. It became the homeland of the Qin, who eventually unified China in 221 BC and gave the name of China to China. But the archaeologists have, and some tomb robbers, unfortunately, have returned to the Zhou and excavated it. And it's from their work that we come to some understanding of how these two cities developed. So with that, I conclude and hope there's some time for questions.
Okay, thank you to all the panelists. We do have a few minutes for questions. You can submit them through the Q&A function. I'll start with a couple that we have. Um, so more than one person has written in to ask about migration and what we know about people moving into these areas that you've described or back out of them. And then I'll combine that maybe with a second question that came up repeatedly, which is whether you have evidence at any of these sites of contemporaneous multiple cultures. Um, Given the constraints of time, you presented all of these cultures as more or less unitary. But what do we know about possible internal diversity at any given moment? Um, Alan, do you want to go first?
Uh, sure. It's an interesting question. I'm just teaching a course on the Inca and the Aztec states, and one of the dimensions of the Inca, of course, is that it is a particular ethnic group. It combines both questions in the sense that the Inca, by tradition, by legend, and by archaeology, seem to have migrated from Lake Titicaca, where I was describing the earlier culture of Tiwanaku, to the area of Cusco, the contemporary or the capital of the Inca Empire. Interestingly enough, they probably spoke a secret language, which was Aymara or Haki, a version of Aymara, and then they migrate themselves. The elite and the groups migrate to the area around Cusco. Over time, over a period of maybe 100 years, they then establish the empire 150 years, and within that empire, they incorporate on one estimate about 210 different ethnic groups who spoke different languages, and then they incorporate them in various social ways, but in particular through the imposition of the language of Quechua, which becomes sort of the lingua franca of the empire. So yes, there was quite a bit of ethnic diversity in the empire itself. But again, they integrated the population through these forms of agricultural productions. They actually were the kind of a thing where the Inca Empire specifically tried to address ecological crisis by these storerooms, and they would distribute and redistribute goods when one ethnic group was having a particular problem with a landslide or a drought. They would redistribute goods from throughout the empire. So it's a massive system that really quite remarkably integrated these populations, multiple diverse populations under the domain or under the hegemony of the Inca themselves.
James, you want to take a quick crack at that one?
Yeah, it's certainly characterized by migration at many, many different times and places. In terms of what I was speaking about with the Hittite state, as I mentioned, the Hittite language is the earliest Indo-European language that we have recorded, which of course contributes significantly to the homeland debate for Proto-Indo-European, which has been a centuries-long debate among linguists and historians and archaeologists where the Proto-Indo-European language was spoken on the world. It's potentially the case that it was first spoken in Anatolia, uh, given Anatolia being the home of the earliest recorded Indo-European language that we have. We now think that's probably unlikely, and that the Hittites were themselves involved in migrations from the Pontic or Caspian steppe as Indo-European speakers spread into Europe and into Anatolia, including what would eventually become the Hittites. These days, there are new technologies that are tracing migrations archaeologically, especially ancient DNA analysis, which has its own pitfalls, as any methodology does, but is nevertheless really highlighting just how tremendously important human mobility has been in antiquity, really in all times. I mean, it's now understood as a defining characteristic of humankind generally, actually, that we're all characterized by mobility and not permanence in place.
Ed, do you want to do a lightning round version?
A lightning round is simply to agree with James that people move around all the time, and in ancient China, that was no exception. We have lots of cultural innovations that came into China from the Transcaucasus region, which also led down into Turkey. So the chariot, for instance, is something that shows up at Anyang. Um, and there are numerous other kinds of cultural innovations, imports that came into China during various waves. In terms of different cultural differences within China, yeah, that too. There are manifold peoples living all over the area, and of course, it's uh, difference between agricultural zones to in the center of China and then the steppe region to the north of that. And that's been true throughout Chinese history.
Hey, I have another question. I guess this is really for James and for Ed, which is you both mentioned early writing in the places that you've talked about, and that you have a viewer who is just wondering if there's a readily accessible book or books that you'd recommend about the origins of writing in your region.
Sure. So, writing in the ancient Middle East was invented in Mesopotamia around 3300 BCE. And wasn't adopted in Anatolia, despite Anatolians knowing about the writing technology from their neighbors for another 1500 years or so. So the very first writing that appears in Turkey is about 1900 BC, and that's actually by Mesopotamian traders in Turkey. And finally, 300 years later, the Anatolian people themselves were like, hey, that's actually a pretty good idea. Why don't we do this too? I'd say the most readily accessible book is by my colleague Theo Vandenhout, 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 who's written a book called A History of Hittite Literacy. And it's very accessible. It describes the Hittite writing system, the history of decipherment, and all the questions that you'd be interested in about Hittite writing. It's an excellent book.
This is one of the most contested issues in human development, I think. We normally talk about the four pristine places where writing developed, Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, and then Mesoamerica. Um, the connections, James mentioned 3300 in Mesopotamia, maybe even a century earlier than that. The figure I usually see is 3400, and then Egypt is 3300. They're so close both geographically and chronologically that one imagines there must have been contact between them. And then the question for China. China, of course, claims that it developed writing without any outside impetus. Um, One wonders because writing shows up in China also about the time that the chariot shows up, about the time that bronze becomes exploited fully. But this is a big, big problem. And a book that compares writing systems uh, was edited by Stephen Houston back in 2004, I believe, and it's probably called The Earliest Writing Systems or something like that. Um, but there are numerous books, and in terms of the Chinese case in particular in English, the very best book on the origin and history of writing in China is simply called Chinese Writing, and it's by Qiu Shigui.
Hey, I'm afraid we have hit our limits here. So thank you so much to all the panelists for sharing your insights. I'm sure the audiences were greatly enlightened. Certainly I was. Just a couple closing things. This summer, from July 13th to 31st, the U Chicago campus in Hong Kong is going to offer 5 summer programs for high school students to apply to. These are programs taught by U Chicago faculty and roughly at the level of an introductory course at U Chicago. And all of the programs are approved for the U Chicago summer session early notification option application. Don't miss the opportunity for a summer of discovery and learning with our U Chicago faculty. Also, please don't forget to learn more about the U Chicago faculty and how they became professors by listening to the Course podcast on Apple, Spotify, Himalaya, and wherever you listen to your podcasts. And the Course podcast is a special production of the U Chicago Hong Kong campus. And finally, you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or I guess that's now X, Instagram, LinkedIn, YouTube, and also look at our website for updates on our future programs and events. Thanks very much, and have a nice rest of your evening, or if you're in North America, a good rest of your day. And once again, hope you enjoyed the program. Good night.